There we go. Okay. I met Julia Riley almost exactly 10 years ago. It was the middle of September in 2010. I was sitting in the corridor outside of the Litskis lab at Laurentian University, and we were all getting ready to go on a long road trip out to my first ever conference, actually. And I was sitting there reading and waiting for people to show up, and I was greeted with a very loud, very enthusiastic, "Hi!" In the decade since, I have on multiple occasions used the term high octane to describe Julia's personality. Although do keep in mind it is 5 a.m. for her right now, so you might not see quite that level of energy, but here's hoping. Julia did her honors at the University of Guelph in Southern Ontario and moved on to do a master's at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, which is where we met. Following her completing the master's, she worked very closely with a First Nation called Magnetawan of the Anishinaabeg people. And then in 2014, Julia landed an amazing opportunity to travel to Australia and study sociality and learning in Australian skinks at Macquarie University. In 2017, Julia received her PhD and then moved to South Africa the following year in order to conduct very similar research on on African cordillid armadillo lizards. Although she joins us from South Africa, she is currently the holder of a prestigious NSERC postdoctoral fellowship at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, COVID and life have kept her from being able to go home in order to do that in person, but she has been doing it remotely. So with that out of the way, please join me in welcoming a fellow researcher, my fellow Canadian, and my very dear friend, Dr. Julia Riley.
Thank you so much for that introduction. That was anyway, that was one of the nicest introductions I've ever had. So I'll just share my screen.
You're muted, Julia.
Can you hear me now? Classic thing to say on Zoom. Thank you, Jeff. That was a really lovely introduction. One of the nicest introductions I've ever had. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to my talk. I'm truly honored to be part of ASSAB this year. It's amazing to see all of the outstanding research that is happening in animal behavior. It's always such an inspiring conference, and this year is no exception. And seeing everyone's hard work in this field is so motivating for me to keep doing animal behavior research and keep asking questions about animals' behavior. So I'm just gonna give a brief introduction, although Jeff kind of already did that. So I study the behavior, ecology, and conservation of mainly reptiles and amphibians. But as you can see from the animals with me on this slide, I've also been lucky enough to dabble in studies of other animals as well as opportunities have arisen, like little brown bats and insects like the mountain katydid with Kate umbers. And I've been asked to give a little bit of a background on my academic journey so far and challenges I've faced and lessons I've learned along the way. So I'm going to start off doing that. So as Jeff said, I grew up in Canada. I'm Canadian, and I did my bachelor's and my master's in Ontario, Canada. And I also dabbled in some work at OMNRF, which is a governmental agency in Canada, as well as working with Magnetawan First Nation after my master's degree. But I couldn't shake academia. It would always follow me and my brain wherever I went. So I decided to go for a PhD, and I got this amazing opportunity at Macquarie University with Dr. Martin Whiting to study lizard sociality. And by that point, I was hooked on reptile sociality, and that's really what I wanted to pursue for my PhD. After my PhD in Australia, as well as a few short-term postdocs, I moved to South Africa when I secured a postdoctoral fellowship there. And even though now I've finished that postdoc and I'm technically at Dalhousie University on the east coast of Canada, I'm still physically in South Africa because of COVID-19 and my unwavering optimism that I'll be able to do some fieldwork this year. Fingers crossed, we'll see. So although that my academic journey really I am so grateful for, and I feel so privileged to have, I can't imagine a better job or a better path. There are also challenges that come with everything in life. And one that stands out to me happened at the beginning of my career when I was a master's student and I was researching turtle conservation and ecology in Canada. You can see me here, I'm braving biting flies to collect some data and do some research that I was really excited about and very proud of. And then after my first field season, I was super pumped to share some of the preliminary results that I had at one of my first ever conferences. This isn't the conference, and I'm going to be very vague with details, but here you can see a photo of a very young, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Julia Riley, ready to take some notes in that notebook at one of my very first conferences. My amazing lab mates in the Litskis lab and Dr. Jacqueline Litskis, and that's one of the first ever conferences I attended. Anyway, during the question period of my talk at this particular conference, an expert in the field who is very well known and I very deeply respected started attacking my work. And he basically shared the opinion to everyone and me in the room that my topic was worthless to study and that I was wasting my time as well as others' time for researching it. And I have to admit that shocked me. And I was really taken aback in that situation. But I was able to voice that I disagreed with his opinion and repeated my justification of my study and why I thought it was important. And I mean, that work is all now published and has actually had impacts on turtle conservation in Ontario. So I do think it was justifiable to some degree. And, but even after that and my response, he just kept on his attack, and really this attack continued until the moderator stopped the question period. And after this, I was honestly quite rattled. And I went on a walk to pull myself together and try to calm down after this situation occurred. And I was very naive. I mean, I was quite in disbelief that an expert in the field would have been so harsh to a student at their first conference. So anyway, I was a bit disheartened at that time. So after I came back into the conference, so many people though in the society came up to me with so much support and so many kind words and saying they were impressed about how I handled the situation. And my lab mates and my supervisor also offered me a lot of support as well. Now thinking back on it, without that support, that moment in time could have had a really great impact on my self-confidence and my career path. I know from other instances at other conferences, as well as stories from other researchers, that similar instances of bullying at conferences have caused them to leave societies or even leave academia. And that's incredibly sad to hear. And later, I learned, after this situation had progressed after a while, I learned that this expert had actually threatened my supervisor that they were going to do something like this at this conference. So this situation was actually about this person settling a score with my lab group rather than really about me or my research, which is kind of even a worse situation to be caught up in. But I took two main lessons away from this, as well as other similar situations that I've either witnessed or experienced at conferences throughout my career. My first is to be kind. And my second is to find your people. So the first one, this is a recommendation that goes for both graduate students as well as experts across the boards. Please try to consider others while making your comments. This is not something that I see often at ASSAB. This is a truly wonderful society. But especially during public question periods, science is full of discussion, constructive criticism, and potential disagreements. And it should be full of questions. Please don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say. We need to have positive discourse in science. But posing and framing your concerns or questions in a way that is kind is always possible, in my opinion. There's also options to approach people in breaks or at social events. And if you have questions or more serious concerns, I've had many people do this, and it brings up some serious issues with me about my work, either statistics or study design. And honestly, it's greatly benefited my work, and I'm super grateful that people have come up to me that way. On to my second point, I really recommend that everyone try to find people around you, either in your lab or your department or people outside of academia. Find people that support you and bring happiness and fun into your life. Maybe something like these crazy people that I have pictured on these slides. Choose a lab where the culture is enjoyable, that you have a supportive supervisor, and lovely people around you. And it really goes a long way. I know that's easier said than done, but I recommend listening and going with your gut when choosing a lab or a group to be a part of. Academic relationships are really long. It's crazy to me to think that I'm collaborating still with my master's supervisor, Dr. Litzkis, and now we've worked together for almost a decade, which is maybe ages me a little bit. And I've really drawn on support and determination from those around me throughout my career. And I think really finding your people is what makes a difference along your academic career journey. So this lesson that I've learned about social connections in academia and how important they are also really ties in nicely with the topic of my plenary today, sociality. So sociality is a trait that varies tremendously across vertebrates. For example, on this figure on the left, pangolins are largely solitary. They only interact when mating or during aggressive encounters. From there, other mammals and birds range all the way to the other end of the spectrum, at which this extreme is represented on this graph by mole rats, which form complex eusocial societies. Now, in Australasia, you all know that reptiles can also be social. The best studied group of reptiles in terms of their sociality is the Agurnia group of social skinks in Australia. And there are solitary lizards like blue-tongued skinks all the way to Gidgee skinks that live in large, complex family groups throughout their lives. And every year we are increasing our understanding of the diversity of sociality in reptiles, expanding it to other species and to other continents. So we're continually learning that more and more species are family living, like leopard lizards in South America, or they have preferential associations with kin, like in eastern water dragons in Australia, or timber rattlesnakes that aggregate with their aunts and their sisters during gestation when they're incubating their embryos in the summer months. So that's quite cool that we're learning so much about kin relationships in reptiles now. But on the flip side of the coin, there's a basic understanding of the sociality of over 99% of snakes and lizards, and even less is known in other reptile species like crocodiles or turtles. It's quite overwhelming, actually, that figure. So if you are interested in learning more about this topic, check out the hashtag Scaly Sociality on Twitter. I started this during my PhD, and now I just use it to flag interesting research that is always coming out about reptile sociality. So today I want to answer the question, why is sociality important? I know that seems a bit silly. I realize now after making this plenary, because you're all you all love animal behavior, and I don't really have to convince you that sociality is important. but it's something that those that are studying sociality, especially I, studying sociality in an understudied group, often get asked and often have to write about in grant applications. So today, by touching on each of these 5 questions, I'm going to try to answer this question with examples from reptiles. So discovering and describing a species sociality is the first step. Many might classify this as natural history research that is largely explorative. And maybe some might have a negative connotations that come with that. But as Dr. Endler said in his lovely advice for graduate students section in the program, natural history research is critical for building the foundation of our knowledge of animal behavior. So much is still not known about animal behavior, and this is the same for reptile sociality. Sometimes a reptile sociality can be studied in great detail, like I'll talk about with the tree skink, whereas other cases, which you'll see in the Craig lizards from South Africa, studies are truly collecting baseline data. So part of my research in Australia was focused on uncovering the social and mating system of tree skinks, a member of the Gurnia group of lizards, and testing if this species is family living. So this wonderful video by James O'Hanlon brings you to my study site in Australia. At this site, I captured as many lizards as possible at the tree skink population at the beginning of each sampling period for over 2 years. Then we would identify or mark each lizard, measure them and sex them. Then we would also mark them visually with a sticker with a unique number on it, and take a tissue sample for genetic analysis. After that, we would release the lovely skinks and observe their behavior for over 2 to 3 weeks, noting if the lizards were where they were located and also who they were associating with. This is really ideal field work. It was a wonderful 2 years working on top of this hill. We also would bring the females back into the lab when they were gravid, and we then waited for them to give birth and took genetic samples from the litter. The percentage of multiple mating of both males and females gives us an indication of an animal's mating system. So the pie charts on this slide show that 13% of females mated with more than one male, and 32% of males mated with more than one female. This amount of multiple mating for both males and females is actually quite low and is similar to other lizards and birds that are described as genetically monogamous. From this project, we also had a large amount of behavioral data, which we characterize as social organization of tree skinks. They were gregarious and were observed in small groups 28% of the time. The social groups were most commonly made up of adult breeding pairs and multi-female groups and parents with their offspring. From this work, I also had a large amount of data on the interactions between the lizards, which I quantified using social network analysis. On the left is an illustration of the tree skink social network at my population. Each point represents a skink. The females are in red, the males are in blue, and juveniles are in black. And each of the lines connecting them show those skinks associated with one another. And the strength of those lines is reflected in the strength of those relationships. Quantifying social behavior in this way, as you may know, allowed me to explore whether certain factors may explain their social interactions. I wanted to test if tree skinks were family living. So to do this, I also had to quantify genetic relationships between tree skinks. I did this by using SNPs to calculate genetic relatedness estimates. And these data are represented by the pedigree on the right. Then by correlating tree skink social associations with their genetic relatedness estimates, I was able to statistically determine that indeed their social relationships were directed towards kin. After this work, and after realizing how little we knew about reptile sociality in general, I used a similar analytical framework to examine the diversity of sociality present in the Chordalidae. Chordalidae is another lizard group with great promise as a model system for research on reptile sociality. I've now studied multiple chordalids, testing for the presence of family living, focusing on species that are known to live in groups. And this varies from species that live in very small groups, like the Karoo-girdled lizards, to large groups of up to 60 individuals year-round, like in the armadillo lizards. For many cordillids, though, we don't have a clear understanding of their grouping tendency at all. And so this led me to scouring the literature, looking for species that had intriguing anecdotal reports about them. And this paper in the 60s by Don Broadley, written on a typewriter, so I'm impressed I even found it online, documents crag lizards and their tendency to live in colonies. This was incredibly intriguing to me, so I looked up even more work on them, and I focused on 2 species for my research: the Drakensberg crag lizards that are reported to live in small groups, and the Lang's crag lizard, which has been reported to reside in colonies. I set out to examine how these species aggregate, noting whether or not they had characteristics that are similar to other species that live in families, like what's their group composition? Is it in nuclear family groups? Or are lizards sharing a limited resources, like a rock crevice? I also examined sexual dimorphism in these lizards because it can give us a clue into social and mating systems. Family living and monogamy is typically found in sexually monomorphic species, like you can see typified in shingleback lizards. So the research team headed off to the Drakensberg Mountains in South Africa. These lizards only reside in remote, high elevation areas, which I didn't really process before we got there. I'm afraid of heights, so this was a terrible idea to study these lizards. But I mean, for the love of lizards, I'll pretty much do anything. So, but it did, because of the remote nature of this fieldwork, it did restrict the methods that we could use to examine their sociality. As you'll see in the next photo, some of these lizards actually live in on the cliff faces of this very high elevation mountain. So we set out to observe their behavior, which we did by walking transects and noting if lizards were in groups or not. I had to climb this very scary chain ladder that, yeah, terrifying moment of my life. And then catching lizards, you can see here James Baxter Gilbert noosing a lizard off of the cliff face in the Drakensberg Mountains. So along our transect, we found that only 10% of Drakensberg crag lizards were in groups. And then in the smaller, more high elevation areas where we saw the Lang's crag lizard, and they were observed in groups 21% of the time. For both species, these groups were incredibly small and they were rarely sharing a shelter site. In both species, males were more colorful, larger with bigger heads, and they also bit harder than females. Here you can see the difference in color visually between Drakensberg crag lizard males and females. So from my observations, I was able to speculate or hypothesize about their sociality. The lack of group and sexual dimorphism in both species suggests that these species may have a territorial social structure and a polygynous mating system. This is similar to what we see in eastern water dragons, as well as Ahrabi's flat lizards, where although, yes, the lizards are clumped on a landscape scale in usable habitat, they are spaced apart and are not sharing a single shelter site and throughout the day. They actually the males actually maintain their own territories. Of course, this is a hypothesis, and so sometimes with the crag lizards, a lot more research is needed to be done to truly uncover their social and mating system. But I'm going to leave the crag lizards up to someone who's a lot younger than I am and also not afraid of heights, maybe a rock climber. That'd be a great study for them, system for them to study. But of course, this lack of knowledge is true across all reptiles. There's still so much work needed to understand the diversity of sociality in this group. And it's such important information to have because sociality influences so many aspects of an animal's life. For example, sociality affects how we plan our research. Take, for instance, if you want to compare the behavior of species between 2 habitat types, forests and prairies. You may assume that any animal you capture in either habitat is an independent sample. But if that species occurs on the landscape scale clumped in family groups, that would not be a correct assumption. You may, in fact, be collecting individuals that are family members, and then much more likely to be similar to each other than an independent sample would truly be. Also, one clear benefit that reptiles have as a model system for studying sociality, unlike other more traditional social species like primates or birds, is that they're small enough that they can be manipulated in experiments. And this allows for endless opportunities to test hypotheses about the evolution of sociality or study developmental effects on behavior. In some reptiles, development, particularly hatching from eggs, is a social event in itself. Hatching synchrony is when reptiles emerge from their eggs and nests coordinated over a short period of time, typically defined as about 24 hours. Benefits of hatching together may include reducing predation rate or having an easier excavation from the nest. And also in some instances, it's coordinated with a particular environmental event like flooding in pig-nosed turtles. I tested for hatching synchrony in 2 species of freshwater turtles with my collaborator, Christina Davey. These turtles are spiny softshell turtles and map turtles from Canada. And we incubated older and younger eggs together to see if they could match their development and hatching time. As well as we incubated eggs in contact and alone to see what cues, mechanical, chemical, or auditory, may coordinate this phenomenon. We only found hatching synchrony present in spiny softshells, and there was no clear trend in regard to what clues turtles use to coordinate. They all may play a role. And it's just pure speculation, but I think one benefit that is maybe worthwhile in investigating in regards to hatching synchrony may be a starting point for prolonged interactions in hatchling turtles, especially as they navigate to their first overwintering site in Canada. This has been seen in green iguanas, where hatchlings actually navigate through the landscape initially all together in a big group. In addition to phenomenon like hatching synchrony, the social nature of some reptiles' rearing environment may influence their development. More needs to be understood about how social behavior in reptiles may impact their developmental plasticity. Because across animals, it's well known that the developmental environment has strong effects on almost every aspect of an animal's life. For example, in social animals with obligate parental care, we know that growing up in isolation negatively affects their behavioral development often. It can reduce the learning ability and negatively affect personality traits in a way that reduces individual fitness. And similarly, in reptiles, the social environment during development appears to impact reptile behavior. In Natrocene water snakes, eggs incubated alone were less sociable. Veiled chameleons reared in isolation were more submissive in social encounters than their counterparts raised socially. Cottonmouths typically remain with their mothers after they're born, but if they're separated from their mothers during this time, females have a reduced tendency to associate with their sisters. And interesting, in all of these reptile examples, we don't know their social system in the wild. So in work I did, we explored whether the social environment during development affected the behavioral development of animal with facultative parental care, the same tree skink that I introduced to you earlier. In some instances, parents and offspring associate afterbirth in the wild, but this isn't always the case. So we reared offspring either alone or with a social pair in the lab and quantified their learning ability, personality, and social competence. So to investigate these skinks' learning ability, we put them through this spatial foraging task. On this vertical maze, there's one specific pathway that they can go, and the X's show where the ladders were slippery and they couldn't climb. So each skink was presented with this task multiple times, and over time they learned how to navigate the vertical maze correctly and access the food reward at the top. And you can see this skink has really already learned how to do this task. They clearly know there's a food reward at the top and actually navigate to get it without too much effort. I then compared the number of skinks that learned this task as well as how long it took them to learn between these two treatments, and their learning ability didn't differ between them. We also quantified behavioral development of these skinks through a series of behavioral trait assays. These assays all targeted one behavior like exploration, boldness, sociability, and aggression. And we recorded these over the first years of the skinks' lives. Skinks raised in groups were less social and more aggressive, which is not at all what I expected. I expected the skinks that were raised in isolation might be more social and more aggressive. But to tease this apart and look at this further, we looked at what the social relationships were in those social pairs, and we found that a dominance hierarchy often formed in these social pairs. And because of this, there were negative interactions between these two skinks, which caused the difference in behavior that we saw between these treatments. We also wanted to look at these skinks' social competence, which is the ability of an individual to optimize their social behavior depending on available social information. We released the tree skinks in an outdoor enclosure, and over the next 6 months documented their social interactions. And we predicted that initially the lizards raised alone would be naive and they would be more social than their socially raised counterparts that were aware of potential costs. Using social network analyses, we quantified the social behavior of these skinks over time, and we found exactly what we predicted. Initially, isolated skinks were more social, but it converged with the social behavior of the socially raised skinks over time. So yes, growing up alone did impact certain aspects of the behavior of the tree skink, but regardless, they were still able to adaptively shift their behavior in a beneficial way when they were faced with new situations. And this is a really interesting result because we don't see plasticity retained to the same degree in mammals and birds that are reared in isolation. So most clearly, this developmental effects information can inform how reptiles are conserved. So sociality is something that should be integrated into any translocation, reintroduction, or captive breeding program, because not only does the social environment they develop within potentially impact their social behavior, but we also know that from work in mammals and birds that releasing individuals in family groups or even with familiar individuals can increase their survival post-release. Also, the social and mating systems of animals can impact their effective population size and population growth rate. So clearly, knowledge of social behavior is something that can greatly inform conservation, although reptiles are globally an imperiled group of animals, but we lack so much information on their sociality. And I really think it's something we need to work more to integrate into their conservation because it could truly benefit that work. This brings me to the last topic I want to touch on, how social behavior can also influence the ecology and evolution of a species. For example, social learning can play a large role in how a species adapts to a novel environment. Social learning is using social information through observation or interaction with a conspecific, and many reptiles, regardless of if we know the social system of them in the wild or not, are documented to socially learn, like bearded dragons, to yellow river cooters. In this study that I'm talking about, it was led by Isabel Dimash Moreira. We asked if social learning could help an invasive lizard quickly adapt to a novel invasive environment. We used the Italian wall lizard as our study species, who is a worldwide invader, and they seem to be quite successful at it too. So we assessed if Italian wall lizards could learn from conspecifics, but as well as native lizards that might exist in the invasive environment that they're entering into. Lizards that were in our social learning treatment would watch the demonstrator do a task successfully, accessing food, which was accessing food from the blue dish, whereas the control did not have this demonstrated for them. And then after the demonstration, the focal lizards would attempt the task themselves. And here you can see a little video of an Italian wall lizard who's aced this task and is accessing food from the blue dish. Nailed it. So what we found was that the lizards that were in the social learner treatment had a higher probability of making a correct choice, as you can see on this graph. And they also made more correct choices on average. And it didn't matter at all if these lizards were learning from their conspecifics or heterospecifics. This is incredibly interesting because it demonstrates how social behavior, especially social learning from either your conspecifics that are newly invading an environment with you, or you're learning from lizards that have lived in that environment their entire lives and are already adapted to it, and how this can benefit invasion success of a species. So in conclusion, it has actually been known for a long time that reptiles exhibit a diversity of social behaviors. This quote by Brad Storm in the 1970s clearly states that. But it's odd how the influence of sociality and social behavior on reptiles' lives has long been overlooked. To me, it's an incredibly exciting field of research because there's so much that is yet to be uncovered. And it's also largely integrative work, which is absolutely fascinating. Not only do we need to still build the foundational knowledge that we have about reptile sociality moving forward, but we also can use that to understand how social behavior impacts reptile biology, ecology, and evolution. So I have to thank a huge number of collaborators who really made all that work that I just talked about happen, as well as a lot of lovely funding sources. And so here you can see all the wonderful people that have helped me throughout my career. Thank you guys for listening to me, and I welcome any questions. I don't know if I should answer them in the chat or if we'll do them over video, but we'll figure it out. Thanks, everyone.
More than happy to do it over video. So if anyone wants to use the raise hand function.
I'm also happy to answer questions about my career or my research, either one.
Yes, you can also type into the chat if you would like. Hashtag think like a skink.
Yeah, think like a skink.
Oh, Fonty.
I think Fonty was stretching.
No. Well, and I raised my hand and I stretched. Great talk, Julia. That was awesome. I don't know much about hatching synchrony. What are the benefits of a later developed egg to kind of not hatch out despite being ready for its other? Are they siblings? Are they usually from the same clutch, or are they mixed clutch? Can you tell me a bit more about that, please?
Of course. So typically in the wild, all the turtles would be siblings or half siblings or in the clutch. And those would be who they're emerging with. In experiments, typically what people do is they incubate either younger and older eggs together, whether that's from the same clutch or separate clutches. In our study, it was from separate clutches because we were trying to control for clutch effects. But so that's one of your questions. The benefit to potentially delaying development, say you're already developed, but you're waiting for all the others to kind of coordinate with you, and then you hatch out all together, which actually is one of the mechanisms by which hatching synchrony occurs. They do try to like converge on their development altogether. It's quite fascinating research. But we don't really know. There's not a conclusive answer to that question. It could be to reduce predation rates. It could be because it reduces the energetic cost of actually digging out of the nest cavity. It's a lot of work. It could also be because they need to associate with their kin while they're dispersing to overwintering sites. Maybe that has a benefit. There's a lot more work to be done, of course, and yeah, it's something we're still trying to figure out. It could also be a combination of all three things, you know?
Yeah. It's super cute. Yes. It's kind of altruistic. Well, at least I like to think it is a little bit. Thank you. It was a great talk.
All right, Kate, you have a question?
Hey, Julia. Thank you for giving us a wonderful talk. And thanks for getting up so early. I think I might be inventing this story, but I'm going to roll with it. So I believe before naked mole rats were discovered, people predicted that the most likely eusocial mammal would be a rodent of some sort. Do you have the hot prediction for us for which eusocial reptile we're going to discover?
Yes, I do. No, I don't really know if they're eusocial. I don't think they're eusocial, but I really, this year, I wanted to look for the presence of cooperative breeding in armadillo lizards. Their groups are outstanding. It got paused because of COVID. I hope I can still do it maybe next year, or the year after that. They're not going anywhere, and neither am I. So their group living is outstanding. They live in these huge groups. I've never seen something like it, even in Agurnia in Australia. It was quite shocking to me. So I really want to see how the hormones are modulated in these multi-female groups with multiple males with juveniles, because not all females within a group give birth every year. And I don't know if it's a dominant female or who's giving birth. Yeah, something to figure out, I hope, soon.
I just want to see a queen lizard. I just want to see one.
Yeah. Me too, I really do.
We'll make a little crown at some point. Ines, you have a question?
Yes, I have a quick question. So all the patterns of sociability that you observed, when the hatchlings were in isolation, and then without their mothers, or is it something? Is this type of behavior also exist in humans? Like if a person grows up isolated, are they going to be? Do you know of any studies that are similar in humans?
I don't know of any studies that are in humans where they've isolated a child from their parent. I feel like there's a lot of perhaps ethical concerns regarding that, so I don't know if that would ever be published, even if it has happened.
I was more thinking like people that are that grew up in a maybe without their parents, and then versus
like adoption
children, and versus children that grow in a big family, whether the behavior changes as
I don't know about studies in humans, unfortunately. There is studies in macaques that happened a very long time ago where they isolated juveniles from their parents, and they gave them they didn't allow them to grow up with their parents, and those macaques are very developmentally challenged behaviorally. Similarly, there's a lot of interesting studies with animals in zoos that are hand reared, or mainly just hand reared or orphaned by their parents, and how that affects their later fitness. So oftentimes in some species, they don't have as good of a maternal care instinct, and so they have a lot of offspring that don't survive. Also, there are issues with being able to mate. Sometimes their behavior is too aggressive towards a potential mate, and so then they aren't able to mate properly. So those are obviously issues where they issues where
cool. Thank you.
Can occur. But I don't know that one about humans. There are a lot of interesting twin studies. I just saw this documentary from Ashton Dickerson. It is very interesting. That was a very controversial study. Indeed. But a very interesting document.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat, and then Caitlin also has a question, and then we'll wrap it up. So from the chat from Utpa, do social reptiles tend to have higher survival rates during times of environmental stress, like drought or flooding?
That's a great question. We really need to answer that question. You should do it, Utpa. I think. I really think that one thing I want to do, and I hope I can do in my career, is investigate how differences in sociality in reptiles may influence their population growth rates and their effective population size. We don't know. There's amazing work by Blumstein on marmots, and he's been able to do that in his long-term study with marmots, and it's fascinating research. But that's one of the only examples that has been able to do it so far.
Okay, Caitlin.
Yeah, great talk, Julia. And great question from Inez, trying to get you to be a psychologist. Going off Fonchi's question, I was wondering, what about the opposite for eggs that are laid later? I assume the costs aren't as great as the benefits of coming out together, but do you know if any studies have looked at whether they maybe don't do as well, or there's like more testosterone in the eggs for the later laid individuals, like some birds do? Are there any like long lasting effects for the rest of their lives if they have to speed up their development?
That's also a great question. With turtles, it's extremely hard to understand their later life benefits because they're a great study system because everyone loves turtles and we all like to work on them. But the generation time to see these fitness benefits, for example, in Canada, painted turtles take 20 years to mature. So it's very difficult to see any like later survival benefits or fitness benefits and quantify them. Also, for hatchlings, there's a huge mortality risk. So many baby turtles just die. And so that's also really hard to measure their survival. Even if you do a great study where you look at all their personality traits and everything in the lab for turtles. There is a study that looks at basically the cost of speeding up development, and I will try to find it, and maybe I will try to track down your email and send it to you. It's looking at kind of effects right after hatching. So size, morphology effects, and also locomotor responses. And they didn't actually find any significant costs of speeding up their development. But that's right after hatching. So that doesn't give you into like later on in life. But anyway, great question.
Yeah, wow, that's very cool. So is the take home that we should work on invertebrates that don't live very long?
I mean, I like invertebrates too, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But if you send me your email privately, I can send you that paper.
Yeah, it is. Can confirm it is difficult to work on a study species that can outlive you.
It is. So, it takes multiple generations of researchers.
With that in mind, with the time in mind, let's thank Julia once again and pass on to Kate, our president, who will talk about the student prizes.